من نیکاهنگ کوثر هستم. با هم درباره آب حرف میزنیم. این هفته میخوایم درباره مسائل مختلفی صحبت بکنیم، چیزهایی که شاید چند مدتی است بهش نپرداختیم. یکی از اونها مسئله دیپلماسی آب هست. دکتر ارون وولف یکی از استادان به نام حوزه آب در ایالات متحده است و در بلند هم درس میده و در نقاط مختلف دنیا ازش مشاوره میگیره. خیلی ممنون که امروز مهمان برنامه ما هستید. اول از همه میخوام درباره ارتباط شما با ایران بپرسم. شما یک بار به من گفتید که نقطه مشترکی با بسیاری از ایرانی ها دارید.
I do. I was born in Iran.
کجا متولد؟
I was born in Shiraz, a very different Shiraz from what I understand in 1960. My father was teaching there at the university. And lived there until I was 1 year old, and have not had the pleasure to be back since. But I have a fond place in my heart for Iran and all things Iranian.
Let's start about what organization. بگذارید راجع به کاری که نهادها و اندیشکده‌ها در مورد آب انجام میدن بحث کنیم. بسیاری از اندیشکده‌ها و ارگان‌هایی که روی امنیت بین‌الملل و ثبات متمرکز هستند، درباره آب دارن کار میکنن و منابع خودشون رو دارن هزینه مطالعاتی در ارتباط با آب میکنن. آیا این کارشون به موقع است؟ دیره؟ کمه؟ نظر شما در این باره چیه؟
It's a very interesting question you ask. I think from time to time, it depends on who's involved. The water people have always known that water is a great vehicle for dialogue. It crosses borders. We have a language that crosses borders to talk about it, and it brings people across politics. It brings people across sectors. It brings people across nations together. And water people know that. From time to time, political people and security people get excited, and my concern often is that they seem to get excited for the wrong reasons. They seem to get excited about the conflict potential and want to approach this as kind of a hard, high political issue, and are focused on things like wars breaking out over water or the divisions that water creates. And while it's useful to have those sectors involved, they bring resources and they bring attention. I sometimes would hope that they would have more dialogue with the water people to understand how you can take something with a conflict potential and then use it to enhance dialogue and to enhance better cooperation across borders.
توی یکی از سخنرانیاتون شنیدم که گفتید مدیریت آب مدیریت مناقشه است و همچنین گفتید که هر جا مرزی وجود داره مناقشه‌ای هم بر سر آب وجود خواهد داشت. میتونید در این باره بیشتر توضیح بدید؟
Your audience knows as well as anybody. You share water with Iraq. You share water with Afghanistan. Most of Iranian water is transboundary waters, and not all of those neighborly relations are as warm as they might be. So we don't have to look far. If we look even just next door. On the Tigris and Euphrates, that again Iran is a riparian to, relations between Syria, Iraq, and Turkey have in years been more strained or less strained. And then you go a little bit further west and you have the Jordan basin, of course, between Israelis and Arabs. And so everywhere water crosses boundaries, there is this potential that it can exacerbate tensions, that it's yet one more thing for unfriendly neighbors to have discord about. But again, it also means that it's something so vital to everything we do that it also brings often unlikely partners into a room to resolve their issues.
وقتی درباره آب‌های فرامرزی حرف میزنن یادشون میره که به آبخوان‌های فرامرزی هم فکر کنن. حتی گاهی رهبران وجود این آبخوان‌های مشترک میان کشورها رو فراموش میکنن. چگونه میتونیم درباره این آبخوان‌ها آگاهی رسانی بیشتری بکنیم؟
It's another good question, and I think part of this is just what gets developed first. It's easier to develop the surface water resources, rivers And there are more kinds of development around surface water. So dams or diversions or irrigation projects. But as you note, there's some 600 aquifers, thanks to UNESCO for doing very elaborate mapping over these aquifers, 600 aquifers that straddle international boundaries. And increasingly, when you drill on one side, you impact your neighbor on the other. Or if you pollute on one side, you end up impacting your neighbor on the other. And so that combination is something that increasingly I think we'll see as the impacts increasingly cross boundaries in more places. We'll see more and more emphasis on it. Fortunately, in groundwater, in most places, we're still in a place to be able to do preventive diplomacy, to be able to get in and develop a collaborative management in advance of too much overpumping or too much pollution.
یکی از چیزهایی که باعث نگرانی خیلی‌ها هست اینه که وقتی آب از منطقه به منطقه دیگر میره، خیلی‌ها در جایی که مبدأ محسوب میشه نگران هستن که سهمشون برده بشه و اونایی که در پایین دست زندگی میکنند میخوان آب بیشتری ببرن و مصرف بیشتری هم احتمالاً دارن. در بالا دست شاید خیلی نگران باشن که چاهاشون خشک بشه، منابعشون از دست بره و خیلی از اون مردم نهایتاً مجبور میشن مهاجرت بکنن. درگیری ها و اعتراضات و مشکلات زیادی هم پیش میاد. آیا راه میانه وجود داره؟ آیا دیپلماسی آب اینجا میتونه نقش بازی کنه؟
How does water diplomacy work out in these situations?
Sure. So initially, I think when countries get together, they're really focused on their rights. And just as you described, kind of the upstream, the water-rich country tends to focus on this principle of reasonable and equitable use. Usually the downstream country, maybe in a drier climate, has been using the water longer. So think Ethiopia contributing 75% of the Blue Nile, and Egypt relying on the Nile since time immemorial. And so the downstream country tends to focus on the principle of obligation not to commit harm. And so you have these two competing legal principles, and initially both sides will focus on their rights. We've been using it the longest, therefore we have more rights. We contribute more water, therefore we have more rights. And at some point there's a really remarkable switch in negotiations where they go from rights to needs. It's like, okay, we get that you have an idea of what you deserve, but what do you actually need? And once you make that shift, then think about the benefits that water brings, and now you're in a position to start to think about how you can manage the water jointly to enhance the benefits. So, for example, let's stick with Ethiopia that's now almost finishing a dam on the Blue Nile, the Grand Renaissance Dam, and initially Egypt was deeply concerned, and there was even talk about violence between the two countries over this dam. And over the years, as often happens, they've kind of worked through, and now are moving towards thinking about, well, maybe Egypt can actually benefit from a more stable flow, from less sediment coming downstream. Ethiopia has said that they'll make Egypt and Sudan priority customers for the hydropower that's going to be generated. And so now you're thinking about how an upstream country and a downstream country can manage their water in a way that really can bring benefits to both. Those processes can take decades. But in most basins, people of goodwill can come together and figure out how to manage water in a collaborative manner.
When people talk about, let's say, the Syrian crisis, many point to the water scarcity between. وقتی درباره بحران سوریه حرف میزنن، بسیاری به کمبود آب میان سالهای 2006 تا 2009 اشاره میکنن که در عمل هم خشکسالی از قبلش آغاز شده بود. اما در همین دوره بود که بسیاری از مردم استان حسکه سوریه از شمال شرقی مهاجرت کردند به حاشیه شهرهای غربی این کشور. و از اون به بعد خیلی از همونها هم، یعنی مهاجران، پیوستن به نیروهای شبه نظامی. بعضی معتقدند که خشکسالی و مهاجرت عامل محرکی برای وقوع جنگ داخلی سوریه از 2011 به بعد بود، اما آدم‌های کمی درباره تاثیر سدهای ترکیه روی سرشاخه‌های دجله و فرات حرف میزنند که هم باعث تغییر وضعیت در منابع آبی سوریه شد و هم در عراق، و حالا همون سدها روی ایران هم تاثیر میگذارن، چرا که آب کافی به تالاب‌ها نمیرسه و نهایتاً ریزگرد اون تالاب‌ها به مناطق در ایران منتقل میشه. در دنیای امروز چگونه میشه از ترکیه خواست که وضعیت سوریه و کشورهای پایین دست رو نادیده نگیره و درک کنه؟
Turkey right now to actually understand the situation that's happening in other countries downstream of all those dams?
Yeah, no, it's another good question, and again, I come back to what I'm hopeful is our move towards needing to recognize that our problems are bigger than our national borders, and we need to look across the national borders for solutions. I think increasingly, certainly on rivers, people are doing this. There's been quite a lot of exchange between Turkey and Iraq, for example, on the Tigris and Euphrates. And I think as there's more stability in Syria, that they'll be involved in the conversations as well. Once again, I think at times there has been talk and even movement towards kind of collaborative governance of the Tigris and Euphrates, at least between Syria, Turkey, and Iraq. And so, again, we can be hopeful that with more stability in the region, those institutions can be strengthened. And as we've seen elsewhere in the world, when you have good transboundary institutions, you have mechanisms for resolving disputes as they arise. Without the institutions, just as you pointed out, an environmental trigger can have political impacts even across borders. And so the hope is, again, more poverty alleviation, more institutional capacity, more transboundary dialogue. These are the kinds of things that help us deal with the inevitable changes that are coming to our water systems.
حالا اگر دو حوزه کاملا متفاوت در درون یک کشور داشته باشیم، مثلا یک حوزه آبریز پرآب، یک حوزه آبریز کم آبتر، مردمانی در حوزه کم آب بخواهند آب را از حوزه پرآب بگیرند و این اتفاق میفته که مثلا در ایران هم شاهدش بوده ایم. حالا اتفاق بعدی این هست که مثلا حوزه دیگری میآید و آب را از حوزه دوم هم دو مرتبه منتقل میکنه. مثالی که در ایران وجود داره، آب را از کارون میان منتقل میکنن به حوزه زاینده رود و از حوزه زاینده رود دولت منتقل کرده به حوزه‌ای که استان رئیس جمهوری سابق خاتمی در اونجا وجود داره.
Of the things I'm willing to do, commenting on internal politics of countries is not. I can say, I think, I'll just say generally, I think there is a shift in thinking. It used to be, as you described, you would move water to people, and certainly the U.S. is no stranger to this. We've most of Southern California is actually sits in a desert. Los Angeles has no business being where it is, except that it's bringing water from as far as the Colorado Basin and from many out of basin transfers. That was the thinking earlier in the last century, maybe. And I think increasingly people are starting to think, wait, are there alternatives? How do we think about sustainability? And when we say sustainability, we talk about the kind of the triple bottom line. So is it environmentally sustainable? Is it socially sustainable? And is it economically sustainable? And I think increasingly people are looking at that as kind of an approach in considering interbasin transfers rather than let's just engineer our way out of this problem by moving water to people. As you point out, when you do that, you can sometimes have unintended consequences that could be as bad or worse than the original situation that you're trying to fix.
And why don't چرا سیاسیون به حق آبی محیط زیست و اکوسیستم ها فکر نمی کنند؟
Ecosystem.
Again, these are values that shift over time, and we're increasingly seeing this. I think part of the issue, of course, is can a country afford to do that? If you're really in dire poverty, if you're in a developing country, and people just literally don't have enough to drink, you're not really in a place to start thinking about the needs of the environment. And so part of this is to be able to bring resources maybe from outside and political will from inside together to first figure out how to a program of poverty alleviation that then gets people to a place where they can afford to think about the longer term impacts of protecting their environment, not at the expense of short term detriment.
خیلی از فعالان میگن که وقتی به محیط زیست توجه نمی‌کنیم شاهد بروز فرسایش شدید، از بین رفتن جنگل‌ها، بیابان‌زایی و از دست رفتن منابع آب خواهیم بود. این همون چیزی است که در ایران اتفاق افتاده.
And then you are losing your water resources. What has happened, let's say, in Iran is that in the last 4 decades, Iran has
در
lost...
طول 4 دهه اخیر ایران بین 85 تا 90% منابع آب زیرزمینیش رو از دست داده. جمعیت از چیزی حدود 37 میلیون به 84 میلیون نفر رسیده. در 7 سال اخیر هم حدود 9 میلیون نفر از مناطق روستایی به حاشیه شهرها مهاجرت کردند. اگر همین مسئله رو با تجربیات دیگر کشورها مقایسه بکنیم، به عنوان مثال اون چیزی که در شرق آفریقا و یا در خاورمیانه رخ داد، آیا این روند رو میشه الگوی موفقیت دونست یا شکست؟
Well, again, we come back to the three aspects of sustainability, and recognize also that the situation. There are many stresses in Iran right now that not both internal and external that may preclude the kind of investments in a sustainable management approach that may be viable in other places. But I think let's take China as an example. Maybe 20 years ago, they really were in kind of this steep path to develop, and they really were. They were investing in dams and diversions and not really paying attention to environmental sustainability. And finally, I think maybe 15 or so years ago, really reached a place where they could afford to start thinking about their longer term sustainability and looked at their especially the dam development. They had plans for a whole series of large dams on many of the upstream areas of some of Asia's biggest rivers, and just kind of stopped and thought, well, maybe there's other ways to develop the energy that we need. Maybe there's some benefit to leaving streams undammed. Maybe there's some benefit to the local population, to the environment, and kind of longer term sustainability. But you do have to get to a place, I think, socially and economically, where you can afford to make those decisions. And so I think all of us pray for a more peaceful time, a time with less political stresses. And less economic stress is where more of the world's population can afford to think about these issues.
Talking about dams, in the last 3 decades, Iran has built over...
بحث سدها پیش اومد. قبل از انقلاب ایران کمتر از 20 سد ساخته شده بود و الان بیشتر از 650 سد وجود دارن که بیشتر از 100 تا سد بزرگ هم در ایران ساخته شده. تأثیر خیلی از این سدها از دست رفتن آب در پایین دست بوده. کشاورزان مجبور بودن که زمین‌هاشون رو رها کنن و آبخوان‌ها تخلیه شده. در دهه‌های 70 و 80 شمسی بسیاری از سیاسیون معتقد بودند که ساخت سدهای بزرگ راهچاره حل مشکل آبه و این درست در زمانی هست که در آمریکای شمالی ساخت سدهای بزرگ تنها بعد از بررسی نسبت فایده به هزینه انجام میگیره و اینکه محیط زیست چقدر تحت تاثیر سد قرار خواهد گرفت و جامعه چه آسیبی خواهد دید. ببینید وقتی که با ساخت یک سد خانه بسیار از روستاییان رو زیر آب میبرید و چاره جز مهاجرت براشون نمیمونه. این روزها درباره ساخت زیرساخت‌های سبز در آمریکای شمالی زیاد میشنویم. زیرساخت‌های برای مهار سیلاب. ما الان در آمریکای شمالی و یا اروپا به کدوم سمت حرکت میکنیم؟
Well, I can give you the experience of the United States. We went through a period where we considered every drop of water that reaches the sea a drop wasted. And we likewise felt that engineering was the best approach to resolving a lot of our economic issues. And dams at that level have great appeal. They provide power, they provide storage, they provide irrigation. And so at one level they can be very appealing, but those are generally short-term benefits at the cost of long-term expenses. And so in the Columbia Basin, which is the basin that I'm from, we dammed one end of it to the other. And we made tremendous strides in terms of power generation, in terms of flood control, and we have all but lost our anadromous fish population. We used to have a rich salmon run, now is endangered. It was at the expense of the indigenous population in both the United States and Canada, who had no say. Much of their cultural and actual survival depended on the salmon run, ignored them, pushed them out of the basin. They lost their traditional fishing spots, and at the expense also of kind of public participation, of the democratic process of wanting to be involved in decision making. And so it's taken many years for us to kind of put the brakes on that build it at all cost approach, and now we're stuck a little bit because we built all these dams, and it's really hard to take them down, even when you recognize in retrospect that they may not have been a good idea. But in the U.S. as a whole, we're moving in that direction. We're taking down more dams than we're building. We're really thinking about how do we enhance the environment, the fish population? How do we bring local populations back into decision making, especially the indigenous people? And we recognize that there are other approaches. There's an engineer had a great line one time. He looked at a park, and the park was flooded, and he said, "You see that bench?" He said, "That bench is not in a flood. It's just misplaced." And so the idea is that we build with rivers, and we work with rivers to recognize that they have expansions and contractions, and we try and figure out how we can do that without necessarily trying to separate ourselves from the river as a vital resource.
We're going to be living in a post-COVID-19 world. ما قراره که در یک دنیای پسا کرونا زندگی کنیم. با اینکه میدونیم از سال 2010 آب جزو حقوق بشر بوده، اما این حق بشری در بسیاری از کشورها مورد ستم قرار گرفته و خواهد گرفت و هرچی به جلو بریم به خاطر فقر و مشکلات ایجاد شده پس از بحران کرونا احتمالاً با تغییری در سیاست‌ها هم مواجه خواهیم بود. این تغییرات رو در نحوه مدیریت منابع آب چگونه ارزیابی می‌کنید؟
Possibly there's going to be a shift. How do you see this shift in water management?
Oh gosh, that is a great question. I'm of two minds. One part of me thinks there's a number of lessons that we ought to be learning from this. We ought to be reminded of how connected we are to each other. We ought to be reminded of how important it is to understand science in our decision making. We ought to be aware of how fragile and tenuous our lives are on Earth, and recognize what a gift it is that every day is. I'm worried that the lessons we will learn may be the opposite. We will just build bigger walls between us. We'll look more insular. We'll try again to engineer our way into isolation. And I'm hopeful that as we've been dealing with COVID, I wish a bit that we would do the same with climate change, that we would let the science lead our policies, that we would recognize that this is a global threat that we really have to act together to address, and that we should be able to cooperate across international boundaries, as mostly we've tried to do with the COVID crisis. That's my hope, is that we learn the positive lessons from this. My fear is that there's also negative lessons to be learned, and I don't know which way we'll end up going. I only know which way I pray we're going.
تا درودی دیگر.